Hello once again, class, and welcome to another mock lecture. Today we're going to be tackling absolute and relative change, and the first thing we're going to do is define these things. An absolute change is a numerical difference between two quantities, and a relative change is a percent change between two quantities. So absolute change, you can think about what is the actual numerical difference between two quantities. Difference here being like just straight up a subtraction. How many more or less does one quantity have over the other? A relative change, though, is percentage based. So this is a ratio, right? You're calculating a fraction. So it's like, this company is this percent larger than another one based on number of store locations. Something like that is the context that we would use relative change and absolute change for. But if we want to mathematically define these things, maybe with some formula so that we can actually calculate absolute and relative change, we're going to need to consider two different contexts that we may be in. One of them is comparing a quantity over time. So you can think about student enrollment or something like that. Maybe a college wants to look at what their enrollment was like when COVID happened, so in the 2019-2020 school year, and they want to compare it to how their enrollment is now, right, in the 2023-2024 academic year. Right? That would be comparing a quantity over time. You're comparing student enrollment over 4 years, 4 academic years. The other situation is if you're comparing two quantities just straight up. Maybe they have not really anything to do with each other, but they're still comparable, right? We can just compare their numbers. I think I was just talking earlier about store locations. That's a comparison that we could make. Maybe this company has this many more store locations than another company. What is the absolute change, right? And that would be just the numerical difference in the number of stores each company has. What's the relative change? And that would be how much bigger, percentage-wise, one company is than the other based on store locations. The formula, though, for each of these situations is for absolute change, when you're comparing a quantity over a specific amount of time, you have your quantity at the end minus your quantity at the start, and you're taking the absolute value of those things. So if you don't remember, an absolute value, right, of a number is always going to be just the positive number of whatever it is. So like the example I wrote here is the absolute value of 8 is 8. The absolute value of negative 24 is 24. Right? So it turns anything into a positive number, which means that even if you get a negative number inside of here, you're translating it as a positive number, and you're saying, oh, it's this many stores less or this many stores more. I don't know why I keep continuing on with that analogy, but there you go. That's what an absolute value is. If you're going to compare two quantities, like in general, not the same one over an extended period of time, Q end and Q start doesn't really make sense, right? There is no quantity at the start and quantity at the end. There are just straight up two quantities, and so the absolute change would be Q1 minus Q2. But oftentimes in context, you're asked to compare a quantity to another one, and so the calculation that we should actually use is Q sub compare, the compared quantity, minus Q sub base, whatever your base quantity is, the thing that it's being compared to. That's the notation that we're going to go with in this video. Q sub compare minus Q sub base, again meaning the quantity you're comparing to some base quantity. All right, so those are kind of the variables, the major variables at play here in both of these formulae. For relative change, right, I was saying that is a fraction. It's a percentage, right? So a ratio is involved. There's some division going on. Relative change actually incorporates absolute change in its formula. So you'll notice that I am actually taking, this formula and I'm putting it here, right? That whatever this ends up being, maybe it's 7. Then 7 would be the numerator for my relative change. Oh, and by the way, yeah, this is just notational stuff. Q sub start means starting quantity, kind of like over here. This is like Q sub compare means the quantity you're comparing to something else. So Q sub start means your ending or your starting quantity, and Q sub end means your ending quantity. Anyway, yeah, I'm taking the absolute change formula and I'm just putting it into the relative change formula. So kind of no matter which way you're going, if you want to find the absolute change or the relative change of something, you have to find the absolute change no matter what, because it's in the relative change formula. And we see a very similar thing happening with when you're comparing two quantities, except instead of a starting quantity, you just have the thing that you're comparing to, which is Q sub base. So these are all the formula that we're going to use in this video. Let's do some examples. All right, example number 1. Western Oregon University's tuition increased from $9,768 in the 2018-2019 academic year to $10,197 in the 2019-2020 academic year. So just one academic year later. I want to find both the absolute and relative change of this difference from one academic year to the next. So from 2018-19 to 2019-2020. So we have to first figure out which of these situations are we in. Are we comparing a quantity over time, or are we comparing two quantities? In this particular example, we are just looking at WOU's tuition over some amount of time, and so we're definitely comparing a quantity over time. We're in this situation here. So the quantity at the start, right, in the 2018-2019 academic year was $9,768. In 2019-2020, it was $10,197. So the absolute change is just this formula. I'm just going to subtract them, and we end up getting positive $429, which the absolute value keeps positive. So $429 is the absolute change from year to year. So if someone asks, hey, how much did tuition increase from last year? You can say, oh, $429. Relative change, though, is a percent change. So if someone comes up to you and says, hey, like, by how much did the tuition increase? Like, percentage-wise, how much are we increasing the tuition? That's a different question. So now we have to figure out what the relative change is. We already know the absolute change is $429, so that's our numerator. The denominator is the quantity at the start. So that's the $9,768. And I got 0.043, which, of course, as a percentage is 4.3%. Now, probably I shouldn't just leave my answer like this. I should say, oh, there was a 4.3% increase from the 2018-19 academic year going into the 2019-2020. So we increased tuition 4.3% over the previous year. That would be the correct way to contextualize this. I just don't have a lot of room to say all that stuff, but pretend it's there. All right, example number 2. Suppose Mock.Coffee has 328 locations in the US, and their major competitor, Nurza Coffee, has 200 locations. I want to compare the number of Mock.Coffee locations to the number of Nurza Coffee locations using both absolute and relative changes to do this. Now, we're definitely comparing two different quantities in this example. It's not the same quantity, right? This is number of locations of Mock.Coffee. This is number of locations for Nurza Coffee. So they're different quantities, but they're the same, they represent the same thing, number of locations. So let's compare them. Now, because we're comparing Mock.Coffee to Nurza Coffee, we're going to make Mock.Coffee the Q sub compare. That's the value that we're comparing. What are we comparing it to? We're comparing it to Nurza Coffee locations. So that's the base, Q sub base here. Mock.Coffee is being compared to Nurza Coffee. That's why Q sub compare is Mock.Coffee locations and Q sub base is number of Nurza Coffee locations. All right. For absolute change, we got to do Q sub compare minus Q sub base. That's 328 minus 200. You get 128 locations. I put more locations because, again, we're comparing how many Mock.Coffee locations are there compared to Nurza locations. Well, there's 128 more of them. It's the bigger number. As far as relative change goes, I'm going to take this exact number, stick that into the numerator of this formula, and then we're going to divide it by the number of Nurza locations, and we get 64%, right? 0.64 or 64%. The question now is what does that mean? 64% what? Well, in the context of the situation, that means that there's 64% more Mock.Coffee locations than there are Nurza Coffee locations, right? We're comparing Mock.Coffee to Nurza Coffee. That's why Nurza Coffee is the base, and since we're getting 64%, and we know that there's more locations for Mock.Coffee, then that would mean that it's 64% bigger of a coffee chain because there's 64% more coffee locations. Now, let's just play pretend for a second here. What if I switched these? What if I was asked to actually, instead of compare Mock.coffee locations to number of Nurza coffee locations, it was flipped and said, let's compare the number of Nurza coffee locations to the number of Mock.coffee locations. How does that change? No pun intended. The absolute change and the relative change. So it looks like this. Okay, here's what our problem looks like. I'm going to keep everything that's on the screen from prior so that we can compare them directly. Again, no pun intended. Nothing changes for absolute change, right? I mean, yeah, we get negative 128 in the absolute value, but you're still going to get 128 when you calculate that. But in the context of this situation, that would mean there's 128 less stores, less locations. Okay, that's the only thing there. Instead of more, now it's less because we're comparing number of Nurza coffee locations. That's the Q sub compare quantity. Relative change is where we see more of a difference. In this example, now Q sub base is the number of Mock.coffee locations, which changes our denominator. So we take the absolute change, which is 128. Now we divide it by our new, base number of stores, which is 328, and you get 0.39, right? Which is 39%. And again, in the context of this situation, what that means is that there's 39% less stores than Mock.coffee. So in one way, we said, there's 64% more stores over Nurza's number of locations. But in the context of Mock.coffee locations, that actually means that there's 39% less stores for the Nurza coffee. So it does matter what is being compared to the other. And you're going to have to look at your paragraph and try and figure out what's the context of my situation, what's being compared to this what base. And those are things that you're just going to learn as you go through more of these problems. All right. So hopefully that was helpful. If you guys have any questions, please leave a comment below or send me an email. Thanks a ton for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.